The death of Jesus was not an accident, not a tragic turn of events, not the heartbreaking collapse of a hopeful movement crushed by political power. It was a calculated collision between heaven and earth, a moment engineered long before nails ever touched flesh. What shocked the crowds that day was not merely that Jesus died, but that he walked toward death with unsettling clarity, as if the cross were not an interruption to his mission, but the destination itself. This truth is deeply uncomfortable because it destroys the comforting idea that the crucifixion was simply something done to Jesus. According to the Gospels themselves, it was something he moved toward with intention, resolve, and authority, and that realization changes everything. From the very beginning of his ministry, Jesus speaks and acts like a man on a schedule that only he fully understands. While others see opportunities, popularity, and momentum, he sees an approaching hour. Again and again, he refers to a time that has not yet come, an hour that will arrive with terrifying certainty. This is not the language of someone hoping to avoid suffering. It is the language of someone counting down to it. When people try to crown him king, he withdraws. When crowds grow large and enthusiasm swells, his teachings become sharper, harder, more divisive. Instead of riding popularity into power, he seems almost determined to thin the crowd. This behavior makes little sense if his death was merely an unfortunate outcome. It makes perfect sense if his death was the mission. Jesus does not stumble into Jerusalem unaware of what awaits him. He enters fully conscious of the machinery already turning against him. He knows the religious leaders are plotting. He knows betrayal is close enough to share bread with. He knows the Roman system will not hesitate to execute him if pressured. Yet he goes anyway, not in secret, not in disguise, but publicly, deliberately, fulfilling ancient symbols that point unmistakably towards sacrifice and kingship colliding in a single moment. The triumphal entry is not optimism, it is provocation. He forces the conflict to surface because the mission requires it. What makes this even more unsettling is how openly Jesus speaks about his death. He does not frame it as a possible outcome or a tragic risk. He calls it a necessity. He tells his disciples that the Son of Man must suffer, must be rejected, must be killed. The language is absolute. There is no contingency plan, no alternate route. When Peter objects, insisting that this cannot happen, Jesus responds with shocking severity, not because Peter lacks compassion, but because Peter's resistance threatens the very heart of the mission. To avoid the cross would not be mercy, it would be failure. The crucifixion, then, is not simply about suffering endured, it is about obedience fulfilled. Jesus repeatedly frames his life in terms of being sent. He speaks of doing the will of the one who sent him, of finishing a work entrusted to him. A mission implies intention, direction, and completion. Sacrifice alone can be accidental. A mission cannot. When Jesus says he lays down his life of his own accord, he strips the cross of its illusion of chaos. Even betrayal, arrest, and execution fall within a larger purpose that low human authority truly controls. This perspective forces a re-examination of the garden scene where Jesus prays in anguish. His distress does not contradict his resolve. It reveals the weight of what he willingly carries. He does not pray to escape death, but to remain faithful within it. The question is not whether he will die, but whether he will drink the cup fully. His submission is not passive resignation. It is active alignment of his human will with the divine mission. The cross is not forced upon him against his will. It is embraced at great personal cost. Understanding the death of Jesus as a mission also reshapes how we interpret his silence during trial. He does not defend himself because defense would derail the purpose. He does not call down legions of angels because rescue would cancel the objective. Power restrained is not weakness, it is discipline. The same authority that calms storms now refuses to stop injustice, not because injustice is acceptable, but because something larger is unfolding through it. The cross exposes not only human cruelty, but divine strategy operating within human freedom. This is where many people become uncomfortable, because a mission-driven crucifixion challenges sentimental versions of faith. It means the cross is not merely a symbol of love, but also a declaration of seriousness. Something is so broken, so corrupted, so lethal to humanity that it requires not a gesture, not a teaching, but a death with cosmic significance. If Jesus' mission ends in crucifixion, then the problem he came to address is far deeper than moral encouragement or spiritual inspiration. It suggests a fracture at the core of human existence that only a decisive, irreversible act can confront. Jesus' words at the Last Supper reinforce this understanding. He does not speak like a victim about to be overtaken by events. He speaks like someone explaining the meaning of what is about to happen. He interprets his own death in advance, tying it to covenant language, forgiveness, and transformation. He frames his blood as intentional, purposeful, poured out rather than taken. This is mission language, not tragedy language. The cross is not an interruption to his teaching. It is the teaching brought to its climax. Even the way Jesus chooses the timing of events reveals intention. The crucifixion occurs during Passover, a moment already saturated with themes of deliverance through death. This is not coincidence, it is convergence. The story of liberation through sacrifice reaches its fulfillment not because history accidentally aligned, but because the mission demanded symbolic and spiritual completion. Jesus positions his death within a narrative that stretches back centuries, claiming not only to participate in it, but to complete it. To say the death of Jesus was a mission is not to minimize his suffering, it is to magnify its meaning. Pain endured unwillingly is tragic. Pain embraced for a purpose is transformative. The mission reframes the cross from a moment of defeat into a moment of execution, not of Jesus, but of the plan itself. When he declares that the work is finished, he speaks like someone who has completed an assignment, not like someone who has simply lost a battle. This understanding also explains why the resurrection is not treated as a reversal of failure, but as a confirmation of success. If the cross were merely a tragic mistake corrected by resurrection, the story would be incoherent. Instead, the resurrection validates that the mission was accomplished exactly as intended. Death is entered fully and then exited decisively, not as an escape, but as proof that the mission has authority over the very thing it confronts. The mission framework also forces the listener to confront a personal question. If Jesus died merely as a sacrifice imposed upon him, admiration and gratitude may be enough. But if he died as part of a deliberate mission, then that mission demands interpretation, response, and alignment. Missions are not observed, they are joined or resisted. The cross ceases to be a distant symbol and becomes a dividing line. This is why the message unsettled people then and continues to unsettle people now. A mission implies purpose, and purpose implies expectation. If Jesus intentionally moved toward the cross, then the cross is not simply about what God feels towards humanity, but about what God intends to do with humanity. It suggests not only rescue, but redefinition. It confronts the listener with the unsettling possibility that comfort was never the goal, and transformation was always the cost. And this brings us to the tension that cannot be ignored. If the death of Jesus was a mission, then everything he said before it and everything that followed after it must be interpreted through that lens. The teachings, the miracles, the confrontations, and even the silences all point toward a destination that he never lost sight of. The cross stands not as an unfortunate ending, but as the central act around which the entire story rotates. To misunderstand this is to misunderstand him. This is only the beginning of the implications, because once the cross is understood as a mission rather than merely a sacrifice, the meaning of justice, love, obedience, and even freedom begins to shift in ways that are far more demanding than most people expect. Once the cross is seen as a mission, the entire moral universe surrounding Jesus begins to realign. His death no longer sits at the edge of the story as a sorrowful conclusion, but moves to the center as the organizing force behind everything he said and did. This reframing forces a confrontation with ideas many would rather keep vague, because a mission-centered death means Jesus was not merely revealing God's compassion, but executing God's judgment on something real, active, and destructive. Love is present, but it is not sentimental. Mercy is offered, but it is not cheap. The cross becomes the place where God takes humanity seriously enough to deal decisively with what separates it from life. Throughout his ministry, Jesus speaks about sin not as a collection of mistakes, but as a power that enslaves. He describes it as something that blinds, binds, and ultimately kills. This is crucial because a mission requires an enemy. If sin were only ignorance or immaturity, teaching would have been enough. If it were merely emotional brokenness, healing would have sufficed. But Jesus consistently portrays sin as something that must be confronted, judged, and neutralized. The mission of the cross directly corresponds to the severity of the threat. A lethal disease requires drastic intervention, and the crucifixion reflects the seriousness of the diagnosis. This explains why Jesus does not dilute his message as opposition increases. Instead, he intensifies it. He speaks more clearly about cost, about loss, about the necessity of dying to oneself. These are not metaphors designed to inspire introspection. They are preparatory truths meant to align his followers with the reality of the mission. He is not gathering admirers. He is forming witnesses who will understand that life comes through death, not around it. The cross is not an exception to the rule. It is the rule made visible. The mission also clarifies why Jesus' interactions with power structures are so confrontational. He does not simply challenge hypocrisy, he exposes systems built on self-preservation rather than truth. Religious leaders fear the cross because it threatens control. Political authorities fear it because it disrupts order. Yet Jesus refuses to adjust his mission to appease either. His kingdom does not operate by negotiation or compromise because its foundation is not consensus, but reality. The cross unmasks every system that survives by avoiding accountability. Seeing the crucifixion as a mission also dismantles the idea that Jesus' death was primarily about appeasing human guilt feelings. While guilt is real, the mission goes deeper. The cross addresses objective moral rupture, not just subjective emotional relief. Jesus does not die to make people feel forgiven. He dies to make forgiveness possible without denying justice. This distinction matters because it reveals a God who does not simply overlook evil, but absorbs its cost. The mission does not bypass justice in the name of love, it fulfills justice through love. This is why Jesus speaks so often about truth. Truth in his teaching is not information, but alignment with reality. The cross becomes the ultimate revelation of truth, exposing what humanity does with goodness when it threatens autonomy. The execution of Jesus is not only a spiritual event, it is a mirror held up to human nature. Given the opportunity, humanity chooses control over surrender, power over humility, safety over transformation. The mission does not ignore this reality, it confronts it head-on. At the same time, the cross exposes something equally unsettling about God. It reveals a willingness to enter fully into the consequences of human rebellion, rather than annihilate it from a distance. This is not weakness, it is restraint. The mission requires God to take responsibility for restoration without violating the freedom that made rebellion possible in the first place. The cross becomes the intersection where divine holiness and human freedom collide, without either being compromised. Understanding the death of Jesus as a mission also redefines forgiveness. Forgiveness is no longer a casual dismissal of wrongdoing, but a costly release grounded in truth. Jesus forgives from the cross not because the crime is small, but because he is bearing its weight. This transforms forgiveness from an emotional preference into a moral act rooted in sacrifice. It also explains why forgiveness in Jesus' teaching is never detached from repentance. The mission aims at restoration, not denial. The mission framework also reshapes how suffering itself is understood. Jesus does not glorify pain for its own sake, nor does he portray suffering as inherently redemptive. What gives his suffering meaning is purpose. Pain without purpose is despair. Pain embraced for a mission becomes obedience. This distinction guards against both romanticizing suffering and fleeing from it at all costs. The cross stands as a warning against pointless pain and an invitation to purposeful sacrifice. As the narrative progresses toward the crucifixion, Jesus increasingly speaks of separation: sheep and goats, light and darkness, narrow and wide paths. These images are not threats designed to manipulate, they are consequences of response to the mission. A mission divides by its nature. It demands decision. Neutrality becomes impossible because the mission itself exposes allegiance. The cross is not merely something to be admired, it is something that judges the observer by how they respond to it. This is why the crowds thin and confusion grows among even his closest followers. A mission-centered Messiah does not fit expectations shaped by comfort or nationalism. They wanted victory without surrender, glory without cost. Jesus offers victory through surrender and glory through cost, and many quietly step away. The mission does not adjust to retain popularity. It continues forward, even if it means walking alone. The loneliness of Jesus in the final hours is not a failure of leadership. It is a consequence of truth. When the mission reaches its most demanding point, only those willing to face reality without illusions can remain. Even then, fear overtakes them. This does not invalidate the mission, it confirms its severity. What Jesus is undertaking is not something human loyalty can sustain without divine intervention. As the cross approaches, everything accelerates toward inevitability. Betrayal, denial, abandonment, and violence converge, not randomly, but predictably. The mission draws out what lies beneath the surface of human hearts. Loyalty fractures, courage collapses, and self-preservation takes over. Yet none of this surprises Jesus. He moves through it with a clarity that only makes sense if the outcome is not in doubt. The mission is not threatened by human failure, it accounts for it. This leads to a sobering realization. If the death of Jesus was a mission, then humanity is not merely the audience of redemption, but also the context that makes it necessary. The cross exposes not only divine love, but human condition. It declares that something in humanity must die for humanity to live. This is not flattering, but it is honest. And it raises a question that cannot be postponed. If the mission required the death of Jesus, what does it require of those who claim to follow him? Because missions do not end at execution. They continue through those who carry their meaning forward. The cross does not close the story. It opens a new kind of responsibility that cannot be reduced to belief alone. That responsibility and the radical implications it carries are where the mission becomes deeply personal and impossible to ignore. The cross is the execution of a mission, and not merely the endurance of pain. Then it becomes impossible to treat Christianity as a system of passive belief. The mission does not invite spectators, it creates participants. This is where many interpretations quietly retreat, because participation implies cost, and cost exposes priorities. Jesus never presents his death as a standalone event meant only to be admired from a distance. He consistently links his path to the path of those who would come after him, not as a metaphorical suggestion, but as a reality that mirrors the logic of the mission itself. When Jesus speaks about taking up a cross, he's not romanticizing struggle or promoting self-hatred. He's articulating alignment. To take up a cross is to accept the same mission logic that governed his own life: obedience over self-preservation, truth over comfort, purpose over safety. This is why he frames discipleship in terms of loss before gain. The loss is not arbitrary. It is the shedding of illusions that cannot survive the mission. Anything built on control, image, or avoidance must collapse, because the mission demands coherence between belief and reality. This perspective dismantles the idea that the cross primarily exists to remove responsibility. Instead, it relocates responsibility. Jesus does not die so that nothing matters. He dies so that everything matters in a different way. The mission redefines what counts as life, success, and freedom. Freedom is no longer the absence of constraint, but the alignment of will with truth. Life is no longer the preservation of self at all costs, but the willingness to lose oneself for what is real. These are not poetic ideals, they are consequences of a mission that exposes false definitions. The mission-centered cross also reorients the concept of faith. Faith is not intellectual agreement with a theological claim about Jesus' death. It is trust in the path his death reveals. Trust, in this sense, is demonstrated through action, not sentiment. This is why Jesus repeatedly connects belief with obedience, not because obedience earns redemption, but because obedience proves alignment with the mission. A faith that avoids transformation has misunderstood the cross. This misunderstanding becomes especially clear when the cross is reduced to a symbol of personal comfort. If the primary function of Jesus' death is emotional reassurance, then suffering becomes meaningless, injustice becomes secondary, and truth becomes negotiable. But if the cross is the fulfillment of a mission, then comfort is not the goal, clarity is. The mission strips away the illusion that goodness can exist without cost, or that reconciliation can occur without confrontation. The cross also exposes the limits of human moral effort. Jesus does not die because humanity is almost good enough and needs a final push. He dies because the gap between what humanity is and what it was created to be cannot be bridged by effort alone. The mission acknowledges human responsibility without placing ultimate confidence in human capability. This balance prevents both despair and pride. It confronts failure honestly while offering a path forward grounded in grace that is neither naive nor permissive. Understanding the death of Jesus as a mission also reshapes how justice is pursued in the world. The cross does not endorse passivity in the face of evil, nor does it justify violence as a solution. Instead, it introduces a third way that absorbs injustice without becoming it. Jesus does not retaliate, but neither does he pretend injustice does not exist. He exposes it, carries it, and overcomes it without replicating its methods. This is not weakness, it is moral authority expressed through restraint. This authority becomes visible in the aftermath of the crucifixion. The mission does not end in silence or fear, even though fear briefly dominates. Those who fled return transformed, not because the danger has disappeared, but because the mission has reframed it. The resurrection does not eliminate risk, it redefines it. Death is no longer the ultimate threat, because the mission has passed through it and emerged victorious. Courage becomes possible not because suffering is denied, but because it is no longer final. The cross, then, stands as a recalibration of values. Power is redefined as faithfulness. Victory is redefined as obedience. Glory is redefined as self-giving love aligned with truth. These redefinitions are not abstract theological ideas. They are practical realities that disrupt every system built on dominance, image, or self-interest. The mission destabilizes false hierarchies by exposing their foundations as fragile and temporary. This is why the message of the cross continues to provoke resistance. It refuses to flatter human ambition. It offers no shortcuts, no exemptions, no private versions of truth. The mission is public, costly, and uncompromising. It does not bend to culture, it confronts it. And culture, in every era, responds with the same mixture of fascination and hostility. The cross also exposes the danger of selective obedience. Many are willing to accept forgiveness without transformation, grace without surrender, hope without accountability. But the mission does not allow these separations. What God joins together in the cross cannot be torn apart without distorting the entire message. Grace that does not transform is not grace, it is denial. Faith that does not obey is not faith, it is admiration. As the implications of the mission deepen, it becomes clear that neutrality is impossible. The cross confronts every person with a question that cannot be outsourced or postponed. Will you align with the mission, or will you attempt to benefit from it without being changed by it? This question explains why the cross both attracts and repels. It promises life, but only through death to what is false. This tension carries forward into how the mission is communicated. The early followers of Jesus do not preach a vague message of inspiration. They proclaim a crucified Messiah, fully aware of how offensive and dangerous that claim is. They understand that removing the cross's severity would empty it of power. The mission cannot be softened without being lost. And this brings us to a crucial turning point. If the death of Jesus was a mission that redefines life, faith, justice, and freedom, then its ultimate meaning cannot be confined to history. It must confront the present. The question is no longer only what happened on the cross, but what the cross is doing now. That question leads directly into the final and most uncomfortable implication of all. If the death of Jesus was a mission, then its final meaning cannot be limited to what it accomplished in the past. It must also define what it demands in the present. A mission completed does not disappear. It establishes a new reality. The cross does not merely close a chapter in history, it opens a condition under which humanity now lives. This is where the message becomes most uncomfortable, because it refuses to stay symbolic. It insists on relevance. It insists on response. The cross, understood this way, confronts the illusion that time has softened its claims. Many assume that because the crucifixion happened long ago, its impact can be safely managed, interpreted, and contained. But a mission that addresses the fundamental fracture of reality does not expire. Its consequences persist. The cross continues to speak, not as an echo of ancient tragedy, but as an active declaration about what is true, what is broken, and what must change. This is why Jesus' death cannot be reduced to a private spiritual comfort. If the mission dealt with something objectively real, sin, injustice, death, alienation, then its effects are not confined to inner experience. They confront systems, values, identities, and loyalties. The cross challenges not only what individuals believe, but how societies define success, power, and meaning. It questions narratives built on self-sufficiency and exposes the fragility of identities rooted in performance or control. At the heart of this confrontation is a sobering claim. The mission of Jesus does not affirm humanity as it is, but offers humanity the possibility of becoming something new. This is often misunderstood as rejection, but it is more accurately an invitation that refuses to lie. Affirmation without transformation would leave humanity trapped in the very condition the mission came to address. The cross does not say, "You are fine as you are." It says, "You are loved too much to be left as you are." This explains why the message of the cross has always carried a sense of urgency. Not panic, not hysteria, but seriousness. The mission reveals that life is not neutral ground. Choices matter because reality is moral, not arbitrary. Aligning with truth leads toward life. Resisting it leads toward fragmentation. The cross does not create this reality, it reveals it. Jesus' death exposes the stakes that were already present but largely ignored. Seen this way, repentance is no longer about shame management. It becomes clarity. To repent is to agree with reality as revealed by the cross. It is to abandon self-deception and accept the terms of the mission. This is not a loss of dignity, but it's restoration. Denial dehumanizes, truth rehumanizes. The cross is the place where truth and mercy meet without canceling each other. The mission also reframes hope. Hope is not optimism about circumstances improving. It is confidence that reality itself has been confronted and altered at its deepest level. Because the mission passes through death rather than around it, hope does not depend on avoidance of suffering. It depends on the knowledge that suffering does not have ultimate authority. This is why early followers could face persecution without despair. They were not insulated from pain. They were anchored in meaning. This anchoring changes how fear operates. Fear loses its leverage when death is no longer final. Control loses its grip when self-preservation is no longer the highest good. Image loses its power when identity is rooted in something unshakable. The mission does not remove vulnerability, it reorders it. Vulnerability becomes the space where truth operates most freely. The cross also exposes the danger of attempting to domesticate Jesus. A mission-driven Messiah cannot be safely absorbed into existing value systems without disrupting them. Attempts to reshape Jesus into a symbol of affirmation without accountability, or love without truth, inevitably strip the cross of its meaning. When the mission is softened, it stops transforming and starts decorating. The result is familiarity without obedience, reverence without surrender. What makes this especially challenging is that the mission does not align neatly with any political, cultural, or ideological agenda. It critiques all of them. It affirms justice while rejecting vengeance. It affirms compassion while rejecting denial. It affirms freedom while rejecting autonomy detached from truth. This makes the cross difficult to weaponize and impossible to control. It stands above factions, exposing them all. The mission also reveals why imitation of Jesus cannot be superficial. To imitate his compassion without embracing his obedience is to miss the source of his authority. To admire his courage without sharing his surrender is to misunderstand its origin. Everything Jesus does flows from alignment with the mission. Detached from that alignment, his actions become inspirational anecdotes rather than expressions of reality. As the implications settle, one truth becomes unavoidable. The cross is not an accessory to faith. It is the axis around which faith turns. It defines what love means, what justice costs, what freedom requires, and what life ultimately is. Any version of Christianity that minimizes the mission of the cross may still speak about Jesus, but it speaks about a diminished one. And this brings us to the final clarity the mission provides. The death of Jesus was not merely about rescuing humanity from consequences. It was about restoring humanity to purpose. Missions exist because something must be done, not merely explained. The cross accomplishes what words alone cannot. It does not simply reveal God's heart, it enacts God's will. In the end, the question is not whether the cross was brutal, unjust, or shocking. It was all of those things. The question is whether it was intentional. And the Gospels answer with unsettling consistency. Yes, the death of Jesus was not a tragic derailment of a good story. It was the story reaching its intended climax. That means the cross cannot be safely admired from a distance. It stands as a verdict on false life and an invitation into true life. It does not ask for applause. It demands alignment. And that is why, 2,000 years later, it still disrupts, still divides, and still calls. Because a mission, once completed, leaves behind a reality that cannot be ignored. If this message challenged you, unsettled you, or made you see the cross in a way you never had before, don't ignore that reaction. Leave a comment sharing what part struck you the hardest, because these conversations matter more than passive agreement. If you believe the death of Jesus was more than a moment of history and still speaks into reality today, support this channel by liking the video and subscribing so this discussion continues reaching people who are ready to think deeper. Share this video with someone who has only heard a comfortable version of the story. And stay with us, because the next message will push even further into what this mission means for how we live now.